are the capacity building NSP is the capacity building arm of the foundation. So we support organizations with all kinds of capacity building so that you all are able to build strong and resilient organizations. We're really proud of this partnership with the Hartford Library, where we get to do these virtual learning series and workshops. You will be receiving the recording and all of the materials, as well as a link to our page with all other recordings and other workshops that we've had in the past. And so we definitely encourage you to share with your board, share with your teams and your volunteers so that you all are learning together, learning these foundational nonprofit management practices together. And so we're really excited about this topic and about the workshop today. But before we introduce our speaker, I wanted to throw it back to Gina. Thanks again for joining.
Great, thanks, Lucas. So today's session is Small Steps, Big Impact, Practical Program Evaluation for Nonprofits. And we are so excited to have Dr. Elena Tamanis Ragusa with us. Before we start and turn it over to Elena, it would be great if everybody in the chat could put their name and organization, just so we get a sense of who's in the room today. And two other housekeeping, as Lucas mentioned, we will send a follow-up email that will include a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. We will also, at the end of the presentation, have an evaluation form, and would appreciate if you could fill that out for us. And now I'd like to turn it over to Elena. So thanks for coming.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Gina, and Jessica, and Tracy, and Lucas. My name is Elena Tamanis Ragusa. I am an organizational and community psychologist. What that means is I apply concepts from psychology and the social sciences and evaluation to enhance the places where we live, we learn, we play, and we work, right? Community and work settings. I'm the president of a small consulting firm, Drive Evaluation Studio, and a professor at Rutgers University in New Jersey. I'm based in New Jersey. That is where I'm coming from, zooming in right now. And I think we have the storm that is heading your way soon, if you haven't already been hit by it. I'm also honored to be a regular collaborator with the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. So I lead the Building Evaluation Capacity Program for NSP, for the Nonprofit Support Program, and do some other workshops for NSP as well. I am very excited to be here with all of you to talk about program evaluation. I'm just looking at the chat and seeing everyone that is joining us, and I can't wait to dive in. I'm going to share my screen momentarily. I'm going to start with a story and then really get into our agenda. And it's a story that is not my own. It's a colleague's story. I have an evaluation colleague named Anita Baker. Some of you may know her. She's done a lot of work in the greater Hartford region. Anita Baker, the evaluator, not the singer, if you know Anita Baker, the singer. And this is her story, but I want to tell her story because I think it's a really good cautionary tale as to why we even bother with evaluation. So I'm going to share my screen so you have some visuals as we talk through this. And this is a true story. And these are Anita's photos that she took alongside this story. So what you see on the left of my screen, you can see my screen, right? Perfect. Thanks, Anna. I can see you nodding. This is a Canadian goose on the left side of my screen. Canadian geese are very common near Anita's home in Burtville, New Jersey. There's a path near her house that she bikes and she walks. I've walked it with her. And she would bike this path and she would see these Canadian geese migrate from the south every year and set up their nests on this little stone platform here. And these two geese, whereas it's the same two every year, would come and they would set up in this exact spot on her path. They would do everything they needed to do, right? They would gather their sticks, they would gather their, I don't know, whatever other accoutrement you put in a nest. They would watch it carefully, they would lay their eggs, they would wait for the eggs to hatch. And then the eggs would hatch. These little goslings would start to waddle, and they would fall off the side of this stone structure here. And the next page shows you here what this looks like from a different angle. And so this ledge, depending on what the water level was at the time, would be way too low, and these goslings couldn't fly yet. And so as you can imagine, they would fall off, and they would often, more often than not, tumble to their death. And Anita would watch this season after season, year after year. And as a true evaluator, she looked at it and said, you know what, these geese are doing all the right things, right? They set up their nests, they watched their work, they had reasonable expectations that by doing all the right things, their goslings would hatch and waddle and eventually live and fly. And in this case, due to the context, right, due to something outside of their control, they didn't get the outcome that they were expecting. That is something that happens in our work regularly. You all know that better than anyone. But the challenge here is that the geese would come back time and time again, and they would do the same thing every single time. They would set up, they would wait, they would watch, and every time these goslings would fall off the ledge, they wouldn't make it. Sometimes the water level might be a little bit higher, they'd get a little bit closer, but they never saw the success that they wanted and expected to see. And that is ultimately, if we bump that up, why we bother with evaluation, right? Because if we learn from what happens when we do it, we can make it better for next time. If the geese had the ability to reflect on that and realize that there is something about this set of circumstances that is not getting them the outcome that they anticipate, they would change something, they would tweak something in what they're doing to move them closer, hopefully move them closer to that outcome. And that is truly, underneath everything else, the purpose of program evaluation. It's not intended to be a judgment. It's not intended to be a way to catch somebody. It's meant to be a tool that we use to ensure that all of this effort and thought and resource that we're putting in is playing out the way that we anticipated, and we're getting to the outcomes that we want. And when we're not, we can tweak and get closer. Right? So that's kind of what we're talking about today in a nutshell. That's why I love program evaluation so much and data as a tool so much, because I think it could be a really useful asset. So with that, here's what we'll cover in our hour and 19 minutes left together. We'll talk about program logic and evaluation, right? So the kind of the foundation of program evaluation is program logic. So we'll start with program logic. We'll talk about some really technical stuff like outputs, outcomes, and indicators. These are foundational. These are the building blocks to your program logic that eventually get you to design a program evaluation. So we'll start with the building blocks, and then we'll move into what a program evaluation looks like, evaluation planning. We'll very briefly talk about methods. We only have an hour and a half. We have less than an hour and a half now. This is stuff that can take multiple workshops, entire semesters for students to cover. And so we will cover it at a level that is reasonable for an hour and a half. We'll leave you with a lot of resources. And I'm happy to have follow-up conversation with folks if you have questions, if you want to go deeper into any of these areas. Throughout this time that we'll be together, we'll have some discussion. We'll have a couple of individual activities. We won't have any breakout rooms, but we'll have individual activities, and we'll have time for some questions too. We don't have any planned breaks because it is only 90 minutes and there's a lot to cover. So do what you need to do to stay engaged, stretch if you need to stretch, take a break if you need to take a break. I recommend 3 things to make this session as meaningful as possible for you. First, to the extent possible, be present, be engaged, I know we have all the distractions in the world around us. Our email is going off, texts are ticking, there's other work that has to get done. Maybe you're multitasking, right? And you're working on something while you're listening to my voice. We know that sort of multitasking leads to less effective transfer of knowledge. So if you are able to be present in this space, please be present in this space. That also for me means be as engaged as you're willing and able to be. So if you can turn on your camera, turn on your camera. In fact, we're going to do an exercise in a second where cameras are going to be really helpful. Throw messages in the chat, unmute, ask questions, really just, I mean, this is your time. Make of it make it as effective as it can be for you. Second, write things down. So this means that when we have an individual activity, please view it as an opportunity to do the activity rather than take a break and work on other things. It also means taking notes where it makes sense. So Lucas and Gina mentioned that you'll have access to these slides after the session, and you will. But we also know from tons of research on how people learn that multiple parts of your brain are activated when you take notes rather than just listen to something. So activating multiple parts of your brain simultaneously will help increase the likelihood that something sticks. So if something comes up in our conversation today that you think is really interesting, write it down. It'll help you remember it more. So things that don't show up on the slides, keywords, or ideas that all of this brings up for you, just jot them down. And then number 3, make this your own. We have 28 different people in this room right now representing, I don't know, probably 20 organizations. So we're all starting at different places, and every single piece of what we're going to cover may not be directly relevant or applicable to you and your work. So take from it what you can, make it your own, tweak it for your context. And those things, as they come up for you, are great things to write down. All right, so one quick exercise before we jump in any further. I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen for this because I'm hoping people will turn on their video. If you're in a place where you can turn on your video, even if you're on a phone, please turn it on. We're going to do something super technical, not technical at all. It's called a hand poll. You're going to use your hand as the poll, as the survey. So on a scale from 1 finger all the way up to 5 fingers, right, where 1 finger is like not at all, and 5 is as much as it could possibly be, what is your comfort level with program evaluation? Comfort level with program evaluation, 1 to 5. Just hold it up. I see 2s, I see 3s, 4s, I see a 5. Christine, if my power goes out from this storm, we're going to make you the host and you can take over. I'm kidding. I see a decent amount of 4s. Okay. And then what is your interest level? I see 2s in the chat. I appreciate that too. What is your interest level / excitement level for talking about this right now? Be honest. Ah, all right. I mean, it's sort of an unfair question because you opted into this. So I'm hoping it's pretty high. I would expect it to be pretty high, but just a good pulse check to make sure. Hopefully by the end of our session, that interest and excitement level stays where it is, and that comfort level has ticked up at least a finger, right? If you're not already at a 5. So that's what we're hoping for. All right, I'm going to reshare. Thank you for doing that. And if you're willing to stay on screen, I welcome it. It's helpful for me to get some visual feedback as we move through this. All right, let's jump in with program logic. So program logic is sort of that underpinning for program evaluation, right? This is how, you can see my screen again, right? Okay, this is how program logic flows at its simplest level. We do something as an organization, as a program, right, as a group. These are our strategies, our interventions, our activities. We do these things. And then they're typically expressed as an action. We offer this service, we intervene in this way in the community. As a result of this, something changes, right? Something happens. These are our outcomes. These are the changes in our population of focus or in our client base or in our community after they experience those things that we just did. So intervention, outcome. And then after a bunch of these outcomes happen and time has passed, we have achieved, hopefully, some level of impact, right? at its foundation, that is program logic. This whole thing is influenced in real time by context, the things around us that we cannot control, and the assumptions, the things that we believe to be true that underpin the connections between the strategies and the outcomes and the impact. If we want to take this a step further, if we zoom in a little bit more, program logic in more detail looks sort of like this, right? This backdrop or this context informs what we're doing. So we're quite often responding to, sometimes more often than others, responding to the state of the world in the activities and the strategies that we're taking on. Those activities and the strategies actually first lead to something called outputs that we're going to talk more about in about 60 seconds. But these are the things that come from our activities. Those outputs we think will lead to outcomes, the changes in our population. Those outcomes lead to longer term outcomes, and then those longer term outcomes lead to some kind of impact. Make sense? Are you with me on the sort of framing? All right, so then someone describe for us, go ahead and unmute or throw in the chat, what your activity, one of the activities that you do. Tell us the name of your organization and one of the strategies or the activities that you undertake in your community. Lucinda's House Community Baby Showers. Perfect example. So Lucinda's House, thanks Lucinda. So the activity, right, or the strategy is community baby showers. Great. Lucinda, I would imagine, has some anticipated outcomes, things that come out of that, the reason why she's doing it, the problem in the world, or the opportunity that she's trying to fill. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Before we even get to what changes as a result, there's a certain number of outputs. Outputs are the way that we quantify the activities. So Lucinda, if I said to you, how many community baby showers have you thrown in the last 2 years? Would you be able to quantify that? I see you nodding. Give us a rough number. 6. So that is her output, right? The output is the quantification of the activity. It's the number of people that participate in a program. It's the number of community baby showers that you throw, the number of tickets that you sell to an event. Now, this is the part that's really important. An output doesn't tell us if anything has actually changed, right? An output tells us that something has happened. I'm going to say it again. That's how you know it's super important, because I'm going to say it twice. An output doesn't tell us that anything has changed. It tells us that something has happened, right? Reporting outputs confirms that the activity occurred. Lucinda comes back and says, we threw 6 community baby showers. Amazing. That activity has happened, right? Outputs are relatively easy to report. I could probably ask any of you or most of you to report an output, and you could. This many people came through our program. We distributed this many meals, whatever it might be. It is that's why we often see them on grant proposals. We see them on grant reports. We see them on annual reports, right? They're easily quantifiable. They tell you that something has happened, and it's great for monitoring, right? Because it's hard to get to the point of outcomes, to get to the point of something that has actually changed, without first knowing that you did what you said you were going to do. And that's what outputs do. They tell you that you did what you said you were going to do. So they definitely have value. And just to drive this home, I think I have a couple of examples here. So if your activity is that you're serving meals at a soup kitchen, your output might be the number of meals that you served, or the number of people that you served meals to. I'll give you a personal application from my own life. If my activity is that I'm exercising regularly, right? The number of times that I've exercised in some period, 1 year or month or whatever, is the output, right? It's counting essentially the activity that I said I was going to do. So our outputs help us understand that we've executed that activity. But we're not doing it just to do it. We're doing it towards some end, right? Something hopefully happens to people as a result of that. And that is where we get into outcomes, right? So outcomes are the benefits or the changes that happen to our participants, to our community, to our systems, to whoever we're focusing on, whatever our intended intervention point is. Outcomes are the shifts that happen as a result of the activity. Different than outputs. Outputs count that it happened. Outcomes are what has changed as a result. For individuals, this could be a change in behavior. It can be a change in belief. It can be a change in attitude. It can be a change in relationship, knowledge, whatever it might be. If you're working at the systems level, there can be changes in things like policy or funding or how services are provided across your city. When we think about outcomes, a good way to kind of contextualize it is they're often the things that we are holding ourselves accountable for with our stakeholders, with our funders, with our board, with our community members, right? What are the things that we are trying to change or create? The things that we are holding ourselves accountable for or to are typically our outcomes. They are more difficult to ensure than the outputs, right? And they're also harder to measure than the outputs because they're a change as a result of that thing. And it's worth saying outcomes, especially the long-term ones down the road, can go well beyond the program's end. Your program could cease to exist and you're still hoping for some of those long-term outcomes, right? Because they're planting the seeds for things that you're hoping will change over time. So let's look at what that looks like with the same examples. This hopefully looks familiar because we just looked at it 2 minutes ago. I'm serving meals at a soup kitchen, right? Here's my output, the number of individuals I serve meals to, but what has actually hopefully changed? That there are fewer members of our community that are hungry, right? That is the change. We can see how this is a few steps out because just because I served you a meal doesn't mean you're not hungry anymore, writ large, right? So there's a little bit of a jump here. It's also harder to measure, but it is the actual change as opposed to the quantifiable piece here. The next example that I gave you was about my exercising, right? So if I exercise, my output is how many times I've exercised in a given period. Does anyone want to take a guess what a related outcome could be from that? You can put it in the chat or you can unmute. What could be a related outcome? Weight loss, strength, exactly, right? Those are the changes. It doesn't matter if I've exercised 42 times in a year. That's just the output. The outcome is I'm stronger. That's what I'm trying to change, right? That outcome should link to a goal. You have a goal at the front end, the reason you even started doing this. That goal and that outcome should talk to each other. My goal was to become stronger. The strategy that I used was to exercise regularly. I know that I'm executing my strategy because I'm counting the number of times that I've exercised in a given period. And look, I'm stronger, right? As evidenced by the increase in my muscle mass. That's that trajectory of program logic. We have a goal, we have an activity that's going to get us there, or a series of activities that together will get us there. The outputs let us know that they're happening. The outcomes are what shifts. Questions about that before we keep going? Okay. So then the next logical question, I think, at least for me, is how do we write the outcomes? Because the outcomes are really meaty. They're the important part. So how do we ensure that we have good outcomes? And P.S., the outcomes are the things that we're measuring later when we evaluate. right? So we need to have good outcomes in order to build a good evaluation. These next two slides have a lot of text on them. I know this, it's because I want you to have them as a resource, so I apologize for how text heavy they are here. When we're coming up with outcomes, we're considering what we want to accomplish and a time frame when we want to see the change. There's a what and there's a when. So on the left side of this slide, these areas, is a list of the typical ways that we see change occur at the participant level. So if your program or your organization works with people, right, you're usually looking for shifts in things like behavior, beliefs, situations, health, well-being, skills, knowledge. If you're working at a systems level, if your intervention is intended to affect systemic change, you're usually looking for changes in groups, networks, policies, culture, social conditions. If you're stuck, or your colleagues are stuck and you're unsure how to articulate the change that you expect to see, which is very common, right? You can pull up a list like this one and say, what exactly are we hoping to change? We like to think about outcomes, really strong outcomes, as having two pieces. They have a subject and they have an intent. I don't know how well you can see the color. Subject here is in maroon and intent is in green. You have a subject and you have an intent. The subject is the who, right? And then the intent is what changes. So in this example, residents in Greater Hartford, that's our subject, have consistent access to food. That's the intent, right? You may have multiple outcomes. So maybe you want for the people that are coming to the program to achieve X knowledge. And then maybe you want the family members of the people that are coming to the program to have this change about them too, as an impact of being there. Or maybe you want the folks that come to the program to have two different intents, things that happen. You can have a whole series of outcomes of things that you're expecting from your activities. So we're looking again for the group or the people or the something, and then the intent, what's going to change about them. And then the last part is the when. So the when is when we expect this change to occur, or the time frame. And I'll tell you from a ton of research in psychology that humans have a habit of overestimating how quickly we can achieve really lofty goals. We tend to think we can achieve them more quickly than we really can in real life. In reality, change can take a really long time. So we usually have a couple of time frames. We usually have a short term, sometimes like a midterm or an intermediate, and then a longer term when we think about outcomes. Short-term outcomes come first. They're the things that we have the most control over. They come immediately after our program or our intervention or our activity, or soon after, right? If all goes as planned, down the road, something else will continue to happen. Those would be our intermediate or our midterm outcomes. If we have them, you don't always need them. I like them because it gives me another sort of milestone or checkpoint along the way before I get to the long term, but you don't need them. And then the accumulation of those short-term and midterm outcomes often lead to some longer-term outcomes or some impact. This table at the bottom of my slide gives you a general, very, very general sense, typical timeframes that we see for programs. So if you're working with individuals, short-term will usually be changes that we're looking for within a year of the intervention or of the program, of the activity, of the strategy. Midterm might be 1 to 3 years out. Long-term, more than 3 years out. If you're working on systems change, hairier, messier, more complex, we're looking for short-term outcomes within 2 years, midterm outcomes from that 2 to 5 year period, and then longer-term outcomes 5 years out. And when we think about when we think about when we expect outcomes, we want to think about what is reasonable. how long it should take to see these results, what kind of capacity you're starting with at your organization, right? Context, so the things that on October 30th you thought might be realistic short-term outcomes might look very different for you on November 15th, right? A political election can shift the time frame in which we might expect some of these outcomes because of contextual factors that are outside of our control, but that might impact our ability to deliver our activities or affect the change that we anticipate affecting. So what are those contextual factors that might influence our ability to reach that timeline? And does it depend just on us? This starts to get a little bit hairy when you have outcomes that depend on other organizations or other people doing their part to make sure that it happens, right? So you want to keep all those in mind as you're thinking about what reasonable change might be, what a goal might be to set and an outcome might be to set. Questions about any of that? All right, so let's do an individual activity. So grab that piece of paper or Word document or whatever you have accessible, and you're going to have about 5 minutes on your own. This is for you. You don't have to share it with anybody. We'll talk about it a little bit after, but you're going to actually do this sort of linkage with your own work. So think about your organization. If you have multiple offerings or multiple programs, pick one if you want to make it, kind of put some boundaries around it. And write down the key strategies or activities, what you do, right? So like Lucinda told us, community baby showers, or whatever those key activities are. Write down the outputs, not the actual numbers themselves, but the things that you are tracking or could be tracking as outputs. The number of people that come, the number of community baby showers we throw, the number of partners that provide donations, right? Whatever it might be, whatever those outputs are, list those. And then spend some time thinking about your outcomes and write those down too. What do you think will happen within a year or 2 years? What will change? And then longer term, what is changing as a result? What are you hoping will change as a result of what you're doing? I'm going to put these questions in the chat so you have them, so then I can go back to the slide with the outcomes, because I think that one will be more helpful to look at. So you can go.
I'm not sure. Well, I want to share because I want you to tell me how to improve this. So one of our activities is providing emergency hotel stays. So the output, right, would be like the number of nights at a hotel. And we serve survivors of trafficking. The short-term outcome would maybe be less number of people on the streets.
Mm-hmm.
And then where I started getting kind of muddy was in the like mid and long-term outcomes. I'm not sure whether these would best be called mid or long-term, but could be improved health because they're not on the streets. Could be that they're no longer participating in sexual exploitation because they're not homeless. I think what kind of got confusing for me here is like, there's like 10 different activities that we do around housing. So like, do they all have the same outcome?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the specific ones, but what you've raised is a great question. And actually, the top right of my screen, you see this box that says resource program logic model template. One of the resources that you'll get when you get the materials after today is a little template that lets you lay all of this out. And the way that it's laid out shows you or gives you the space to be able to say, look, these outcomes that we're listing here are the accumulation of a combination of these activities, right? So the reality is, could you draw a one-to-one link? Maybe. But maybe it's the fact that you're giving them emergency hotel stays, you're giving them resources, you're giving them these 3 or 4 different things, and those together could result in a short-term outcome that's something like people feel, the victims of trafficking all of a sudden feel more empowered to be able to, or feel more confident in their ability to find longer-term housing. Maybe another short-term outcome is that they have access to and connected with a bigger network of people that are available to them. Right. And then from those, longer term, you're going to expect improved health. stability, right? All of the other components that would come from that. So the short answer to Amy's question is it doesn't have to be a 1-for-1, right? The longer version is you want to think about what the combination of those things could reasonably link to, and how those could then down the road lead to other changes. And some of those longer term changes, part of the reason why it gets muddy, some of those longer term changes are way outside of your control, right? You know that you can connect them to an additional resource. You know that you could provide them with X knowledge. So you could say short-term outcome, they have more knowledge about the resources available to them. They have, right? You can't say that they're going to necessarily have improved health down the road. There's a jump there, right? Because that relies on a lot of other things. You can still hope for it longer term, but hold yourselves accountable to the short-term pieces that are more in your control. Does that make sense? Let's hear from one more person. Thanks for Amy for sharing. Does anyone else want to walk us through? Yeah, please go ahead. Let's go. Is it
Violette?
Violette, and then we'll do Anna too.
Okay. So what we do is we teach young people how to change legislation and policy. So we have a bunch of activities where they speak to legislators. Well, they identify the issue, speak to legislators, identify partners, find a sponsor for whatever legislation it is. And our outcome, our short-term outcome within a year or so is just awareness of the issue that we want to change policy on. Our long-term, which can take 2 to 5 years, is the actual legislation actually passing or the policy actually changing. And the time frame varies based on what the policy is. If it's something that everybody really likes, it's really quick. But if it is something that may have things that people are against, it may take a long time. And the other thing that influences it is who our legislators are, the political climate, who the decision makers are, because if that changes, you might have to start over, or they may be more conservative or more liberal, and that can impact your outcome. So,
yep. And that can impact, I love that example, because that sort of contextual change, right? That piece that's outside of your control, that can impact not only the timeline of your outcomes. Maybe the outcome is the same, but instead of 2 to 5 years, now it's 5 to 6. Or it might even change the outcome itself, where all of a sudden, if you're being realistic, maybe it's not that we're going to pass this legislation, it's that we're going to protect this existing legislation that might otherwise get stripped away. And that could be a win, right, in a particular administration. So that's the other piece that's important here, and Violette's comments help remind me to share it. It's that this is people don't like this term, but it's a living, breathing document. Meaning that as you lay out your program logic, it needs to change over time. As you learn things, it changes. As context changes, it changes. As you realize, oh, we're achieving these things quicker than we thought or later than we thought, we move them around, right? So it will continue to shift just like your work continues to shift. So thank you for sharing that. Anna, let's hear from you too.
Okay, so where I work at a nonprofit organization here in Hartford is that we work with AmeriCorps members, and they go into high schools mostly to try to engage 9th to 12th graders in public health. So it's called Youth Health Service Corps. So our strategy or activities that our AmeriCorps members go into these schools, give presentations about public health, education, and career. The output is we try to reach at least 100 of these students from September through July. September of the current year to July of the following year. And the short-term outcome is basically to get them excited about careers, education, and later on careers in health, public health. The long term, of course, is for once they reach that peak, that interest, then it's something that they pursue.
Yep.
Right, in education, and then later on careers in public health. And this is for male and females. And I think for the most part, we try to target high schoolers because right now, as we all know, there is not a lot of male that go into public health careers or education. So we try to get them early enough where, they're interested in pursuing that.
I appreciate you sharing it. It's a great example because it really highlights the difference here between output and outcome. Anna could report out, we've connected with 110, right, high schoolers. Great. But if 0 have increased excitement about this field, it doesn't actually move her closer to her goal at all, right? That's the difference between the output and the outcome. So the outcome there is that change in belief or perception or excitement. That's the part that's actually different. The number of people with whom you have actually made contact isn't telling you the story of the impact that your organization is having. So I appreciate that that trajectory. And then the other piece that she said, her intervention is 9 through 12th graders. Her longer term outcome is pursuing this after high school. Right? So that longer term outcome comes way later than the time that you have intervention point with them, which is appropriate timing for a longer term outcome. All right. Feeling good about this? Let's keep going. So there's one more piece here. And this is the how. So outcomes can be a little bit hard to wrap our heads around. Right? We talked about the what, we talked about the when. The wrapping our heads around can get hard when we think about how we're going to measure it. Because really, then like the program evaluation side comes in around measurement. So the indicators is another technical term. Indicators tell you when you have achieved an outcome. This is how we know that it has happened. An indicator is something measurable. It can be observed, it can be heard, it can be read, it can be, tasted, right? It is the measurable part of what we're expecting to see. It actually is showing us, right? It's the change in Anna's example. It's the how we're going to know that there's more excitement among these people. In Amy's example, it's the how we're going to know that there's improved well-being down the road for her population. Right? In Violette's example, it's how we're going to know that there is support for there is increased knowledge about this policy or this policy issue in that short-term realm. So how do we identify indicators? There's a rule that I like to use. This is how I was trained 25 years ago, and I still use it now day to day in my evaluation work. And it's really simple. It's I'll know it when I see it. We fill that in. I'll know that I have achieved X, right? Whatever my outcome is, when I see blank. And whatever that blank is my indicator. It's the really observable, measurable part of it. And I take every one of my outcomes and I run them through that sentence. So for example, if my outcome is immigrants are aware of the services available to them, right? Amy, something like this could be relevant for yours, right? Your folks are aware, their victims are aware of the services available to them. I'll know that has happened when I see what? Maybe it's a greater number of inquiries for services at our partner agencies, right? That is quantifiable, that is measurable. I can say I know that that's happening because we have more inquiries. Or if I'm looking at a more kind of systemic level, I'll know that a community revitalization project is finally sustainable. Let's say my outcome is that I want this project to be sustainable. What does that mean? I'll know it when I see that project has diverse and consistent revenue streams from both private and public sources. right? It's something that I can actually go and measure. So example 3 is yours. So take a couple of minutes, pick one of your outcomes. If you finish one, do a second one. Pick one of those outcomes that you wrote down and try and develop an associated indicator. You'll know that this has been achieved when you see what. Outcome and the associated, thanks, Tracy. Share with us your outcome and the associated indicator.
Well, for me to further put that
Yep.
information out there, is we do surveys at the end of the year. Not at the end of the year, but at the end of that program year, and try to find out from the high schoolers, you know, where they're at as far as their interest in public health, to further their education or career path. So I'll know that this outcome has been achieved when I see the results of those surveys and see how many interests we piqued for the public health career.
Yeah, and even more specifically, right? You could say, I'll know that there's increased excitement when the answer to this question
Right.
is this survey item is this, right? When they answer this in this way.
Yeah.
So it makes it really measurable for you, and then you know the purpose of that question. So I love that. As an aside, because I'm a nerdy evaluator, I use this in my non-work life too. I use it with my children, right? When I ask them, this is a true story, when I ask them to clean their rooms before they head into their room, I'll say, how am I going to know that it's clean, right? And so I'll say, we'll stay together, no more toys on the floor, clothes are in the hamper, books are on the bookshelf. These are indicators that the room is clean, right? I use that so we're on the same page about what it means when we say that we have a clean room. That's important as an organization because you can say an outcome like people are going to be excited about this, but you and your board or your staff or your stakeholders or your funders might have a different definition of what that means. So these indicators are really important to craft and to share, right? Because then everyone has the same operational definition of what it means to achieve this outcome. My kids and I, before they even go clean the room, have the same definition of what it means that that room is clean. That saves us a lot of strife on the back end when they've put in all this resource and they haven't met my expectations. All right, let's keep going. So all of this, everything we've talked about in the last 58 minutes, has been a lead up, basically. It's the foundation. It's not a lead up. It's the really important undergirding to program evaluation, right? All of these steps, thinking through the activities, thinking through the outputs, thinking through the outcomes, thinking through the indicators, are a good precursor and prep before you do an evaluation. If you bring in an external evaluator or you've worked with an external evaluator, they will often say to you, do you have a logic model? Do you have a theory of change? Do you have outcomes that you're expecting? Because you build your evaluation, program evaluation, to assess the extent to which you're meeting these outcomes that you all just wrote down, right? So program evaluation intersects with program logic. We just focused on program logic. Program evaluation intersects with program logic in a couple of ways. One, it helps inform the design of new initiatives. So if you're going to design something completely new, You can sit down and lay it out and say, I think we're going to do this. This is what we're expecting to see. An evaluation can help inform that. It helps you understand what is working for who, when, and why, right? Because it might be working for one subset of your population, but not another. And it helps make the case. Often this is where a lot of people focus. They think they have to do evaluation for case making, right? For funders, et cetera. And that's part of it. But it's only one part. It can also help do what you're doing even better, and it can help inform the design of new things as well. There are 3 types of program evaluation you should be aware of. If you're probably already doing this one. In fact, before I even show it, how many of you currently track, you can just show of hands, how many of you currently track and report on a lot of the outputs that we talked about? Numbers, reach, right? A lot of people do it. How many people come through your doors, how many hours they spend with you, how many things you produce, maybe changes in that. Last year we did this many, this year we did that many. If you're doing this, you're already doing evaluation. This is called monitoring. This is the first level of evaluation, right? It's legitimate, and in some cases, it's all you have to do, and it's sufficient. So you're already engaging in it. If you are tracking any sort of key metrics, outputs, or outcomes, you are engaging in some level of evaluation. Good work. There's a next level that you can go to if you wanted to, and you might consider developmental or formative evaluation. This is what you do in real time. It's that, what's that, building the plane as you fly it, that adage. It's doing an evaluation while you're doing your program or your activities or whatever it is. It helps understand the process, it helps understand the implementations, and it helps understand the immediate outcomes that come right after your intervention. Right? So in Anna's case, that survey that they do right after they engage with students, right? That sort of assessment comes with developmental evaluation. It's what happens during the program, and it helps inform ongoing your tweaks to the work, and it has some outcomes with it too, so you can report out on those outcomes. This is the most common form of evaluation when you dig beyond monitoring. The other third option is outcomes or summative evaluation. This is the most complex and hardest to do. In our image here, it is the full tree, right? You've planted a seed, you've gotten a seedling, you've given it time, you've watered it, you've hoped all the conditions are good, you now have a full tree. It is the most impactful form of evaluation because it's the one that says, long after this thing has ended, here is the long-term impact it has had, right? So after this session in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, the Hartford Public Libraries and the Hartford Foundation are going to give you a survey, and they're going to ask you about how this session went. That helps inform formative evaluation. Gives us tweaks, things to change in the future, right? If they reach out to you in a year and they say, hey, remember on December 11th, 2024, you went to that workshop? What has changed in your practice at your organization as a result of that workshop a year later? Now we're getting into outcomes evaluation, right? Long after it has ended, how have things changed? In Violette's example, 2 to 5, 6 years down the road, what policy has changed? In Anna's example, when they hit college, are they pursuing public health, right? It's that down the road part. When we conduct evaluation, it has basically 4 steps. Whether you're doing developmental, real-time, iterative evaluation, or you're doing outcomes evaluation, there are 4 general steps. We specify a question that we want to answer. We figure out how we're going to collect that information. We collect it and analyze it, and then we report on it. And really, this looks like a linear model, but it's really more like a cycle, right? And then after we report on it, we tweak our question and we keep going. So first up, specifying our evaluation question. A good evaluation question, well, let me back up. The evaluation question is the thing you want to know. So you peek at that list of that list of outcomes that you have, and you say, what is it that I want to know about my program based on all these outcomes that we're trying to achieve? An evaluation question is usually some sort of like bigger, overarching question that you want to know about your program. It's usually tied to your outcomes or your services. It might be something like, I'm actually going to skip forward on this slide. There's a lot of language on this slide because I want it to be a resource for you. I'm going to come back to it, but I'm going to skip forward and show you a sample evaluation question. What do participants get out of our workshops? Right? It's a sample evaluation question. Just unmute or put in the chat. What's an example of an evaluation question somebody could ask about their program? What do you think? So Amy, bump that up even bigger, right? Housing status is going to be a specific question you ask in an intervention with somebody. What is the question you're going to ask about the program based on housing status? What are you going to want to know? Bigger level than that, about across your victims. It doesn't have to be Amy. What might Amy want to ask when she looks across all the people that she works with as it relates to housing status? I see you typing, so I'm going to wait. Any other thoughts? What might you want to know about people's housing status across participants?
I would want to know if they feel safe.
So to what extent, right? To what extent does our group, not about a specific individual, but to what extent do our victims feel safe? Would be a great evaluation question. To what extent does the housing status change for people that come through our doors? Great evaluation question, right? An evaluation question is not a specific question you're going to ask a person. It's a question you're going to ask about your program to see what impact it's having when you bump it up, right? So Lucinda, in your case, what impact are community baby showers having on the people that are the recipients of them, right? In Amy's case, what impact are we having on people's housing status? Or how safe do the victims that come through our door feel after they've interacted with us? So evaluation questions are higher level. This slide gives you a little bit of a checklist as you're crafting an evaluation question. And remember, we craft it because then that's the question that we're going to answer with our evaluation, right? So we ask this question and we have a whole evaluation to answer. So this slide is a good sort of checklist to work through as you're writing an evaluation question to make sure that you've hit enough of these marks. You might have heard of something called SMART, the SMART acronym: specific, measurable, right? Attainable, relevant, time-bound. We talk about evaluation questions as being SMART too, and really they're SMARTY. And there's two more here that we're going to talk about. So as you're writing an evaluation question, you want to think, is it specific, right? Is it clear? Is it measurable? Is it something I could answer with data? Is it attainable? Meaning, do I have the resources available to answer this question? Is it relevant? Is the answer going to mean something to me? Is it timely or time bound? Is it related to a specific period of time? And then the IE of SMARTY, is it inclusive? This is the counterbalance to being specific. While you want it to be specific, you don't want to make it so specific that it excludes really critical perspectives, right? So is it inclusive? And is it equitable? Is it worded in a way that makes room for the context, the systemic stuff, the cultural stuff, the sociopolitical stuff that could be impacting the data that you're using to answer it. So you'd write a question, and then you'd go back and say, all right, let me see the extent to which it checks these boxes. And let me give you an example of what that looks like. So we just looked at this question a minute ago. What do participants get out of our workshops? That's a perfectly reasonable question, right? We might want to know what that is, and we're going to go collect some data to answer it. You could ask it. When I worked this question through that SMARTY framework, those 7 pieces that we looked at on the slide before, I changed it a little bit, made it a little bit more specific. So here's, in my opinion, a better version of this. What do adult participants, so I'm getting more specific because maybe we have children and adults, right? So I want to narrow in on how do the adult participants experience which of our workshops? Well, I really want to understand our financial literacy workshops, right? Because maybe we offer 5 different workshops and types of workshops, and I really want to narrow in on this subset for some reason. Maybe that's the one that's up for more future funding. Maybe that's the one we're thinking about cutting. Maybe that's the one that we don't know anything about, so it's time that we understand it a little bit better. Maybe it's the one that anecdotally people tell us is really good, but we want to understand in a systematic way whether or not it's actually achieving some outcome. Maybe there's a funder that's funding this specific one and they want really concrete data about it, and so we have to evaluate it. Whatever the reason is, we're focusing on our portfolio of financial literacy workshops. So it's better. I run it through that SMARTY framework again, that checklist on the previous page, and I make it even more specific, even more well-rounded. So what concrete knowledge? Now I don't want to know how they experience it. I want to know what knowledge they gain. I've narrowed it, right? What concrete knowledge do adults in this particular age group, because there could be older adults, there could be younger adults, but I am, for whatever reason, interested in this 25 to 55 band. So what concrete knowledge do these adults retain from our workshop after 3 months? So now this is not just about what do they get out of it, how do they experience it, how do they feel when they leave. I want to know what it is they've learned about financial literacy after 3 months. Now I can take this and I can design a survey or whatever it is that I'm going to use because I have a really concrete sense of what I want to know. Now, is this the best evaluation question I could come up with? Absolutely not. You could keep doing this. Or maybe I decide that the better one was good or the good one was sufficient, right? It's you're never going to get it perfect. You want it to be useful. And that's why there is no right or wrong answer for an evaluation question. It depends what is relevant for your work at that time. You could absolutely ask how their financial practices have changed. I'm looking at the chat and Amy's question. That would be a great evaluation question, right? There are no wrong answers. It's really about what's going to make sense for your organization. The only caveat I'd put around that is that it's not about a specific participant. It's about an experience of a program or a component of a program across a group. Does that make sense? If this makes sense, you're in great shape because this is one of the hardest concepts around evaluation to wrap your head around. Once you have this, the evaluation question, the rest of it becomes much easier because what you're doing next is, and actually I was going to give you time. Yeah, you know what? I still am. It's only going to be 3 minutes. So it's going to be tight, but take 3 minutes and jot down thoughts that you have while it's fresh for an evaluation question that would make sense for your organization. You're only going to have 3 minutes. So you're not going to have time to run it through that framework. So that's a to-do later if this is something that you're interested in, right? To flesh. Thanks, Tracy. I'm really making this hard for you with all the starting and the stopping of the recording. Flag it as something you can go back to later to finesse a little bit more, especially if you want to work it through that framework and make sure that it's the right sort of fit for what it is that you have resources for. And what I mean by that is the next piece of this. So remember, the first step was establishing the evaluation question. The second piece of this Yes, to answer your question, evaluation questions about the program are different from what you actually ask your participants. What you actually ask your participants are the specific items that ladder up to that evaluation question, right? So you're going to ask them or observe or look for some specific things. The accumulation of those specific things answer your evaluation question. So the next piece of this is where you develop your evaluation design, right? And if anyone is wondering, this is supposed to be an artist palette, not a cookie. I'm looking at it now. It looks sort of like a cookie, not intended to be a cookie. The design is, to Amy's question in the chat right now, the design is the combination of ways that we're going to collect the information to answer that evaluation question. So that evaluation question might feel really great. And then you realize that to answer it, you're going to need to ask a whole bunch of, you're going to have to do a survey, and we're going to have to do observations, and we're going to have to follow up with them 3 months later. And oh man, this is a lot, right? And we don't have the resource to be able to do that. So we're going to actually go back and tweak our evaluation question a little bit to make it reasonable and realistic. So there's a little bit of an iterative process between step 1 and step 2. Because you can specify and design an evaluation question that feels great, but the actual way that you're going to have to answer it is way too complex to do it with the resources or the time or the whatever it is that you have. And so you tweak until you get to a combination that feels really good. So when you're thinking about developing an evaluation design, this step 2, I can't emphasize this enough. Start with what you have. You probably have access to a lot of information. Maybe it's attendance sheets. Maybe it's an intake form. Maybe it's emails that people have sent you after they've gone through your experience and they're telling you how wonderful it was. Maybe it's feedback that you collect from them as they're leaving. If you already have something that you are collecting or that you are tracking, check the extent to which you could use those things first. It makes any additional data collection more streamlined, which makes it easier. So first thought is, what do you develop the evaluation question. Here's the thing we really want to know. What do we already have that can help answer that? Then you start thinking about methods, right? And it is not by accident that we are at 118 and we're ending at 130, and we're only now thinking about data collection methods. Folks assume that when you're talking about evaluation, the immediate thing you're going to do is go design some kind of tool, right? The reality is there is a ton of pre-work, all the stuff that we talked about around thinking through your outputs and your outcomes and your indicators, your intended impact, the evaluation question. That's all the pre-work. You know how to do it, but that's all the pre-work that you do before you get to the point of designing these instruments. So now that we have a sense of what we want to know, now we go and design. And we could either do, these are the 5 most typical methods that we use in evaluation. You've probably heard of some, you've probably designed some. My guess is you've been part of the participant group for some. Record review is reviewing existing things that you have. If you take your attendance forms and you're looking to see how often people show up, what that sweet spot is, maybe they come 4 times and they drop off, right? Or maybe they come on Tuesdays and they don't come on Thursdays. If you're looking and you're analyzing existing either internal or external documents, that is a record review. That is a very valid way to do evaluation, taking existing documents that already are being collected or were collected. Second, observations. Watching participants to understand their behavior or their characteristics in a setting, usually with some kind of protocol, checklist, or something that you're looking for. And then you're watching to see if those things happen. That's an observation. Interviews and focus groups are similar. Interviews tend to be one-on-one, right? You or somebody else with one participant where you're asking them questions about an experience. Focus group tend to be facilitated discussions, 6 to 8 or 5 to 8 people, a facilitator that's asking questions. People can build on each other's answers, usually about a specific topic or an experience. And then the most common that we see all the time, surveys. Paper surveys, online surveys, phone surveys, right? But series of questions, usually pretty structured. You might have some open-ended, but also some closed-ended, that ask specific questions about an experience or a shift in beliefs or something like that. We could do an entire hour and a half. We could do multiple hour and a halves, days on each of these methods, right? The nonprofit support program website, the NSP website, has some resources for data collection. We've done some workshops through NSP that cover these different methods. We just did a whole 3-hour stretch just on surveys, and another 3-hour stretch on like off the beaten path, non-traditional methods. So like not the stuff you see here, but other types of methods that you might use. Those are all recorded. I'm looking at Tracy and Lucas to confirm this for me. They're all recorded. They're all webinars that are sitting on the NSP site. They're accessible. So you can go through any of those at any time and access them. We'll also share some resources specifically around data collection. I wish we could get into this more today, but the time just doesn't allow it. So if you need additional resources beyond what's available on the NSP site, don't hesitate to reach out. You'll have my email address. It's at the end of the slide deck. I can happily send you some stuff too, but there is a ton. There is a ton on the NSP site, specifically around data collection. So you collect your data, you analyze your data, and then you summarize, share, and use the information, right? You know, if you ever watch like a cooking segment on a show, they like show you all the ingredients and then all of a sudden they pull out of the oven the finished thing and they're like, here it is, and this is what it looks like. That's pretty much what I'm doing to you right now. Because I know it is not easy to collect and analyze and summarize and share information. I know. I shouldn't just be skipping over these things. Again, though, this is another area where there are a lot of existing resources. We've done, not just me, NSP has done a lot on using and sharing how to do reports with quantitative data, how to do reports with qualitative data, how to pick the right, there's actually in your resources for today, 3 different tools to pick the right chart for how you're going to show numbers. So there's a lot of resources out there around this. Again, this is an area where if you want additional resources after you spend some time on that site, if you want additional resources, if you've gotten to the point of, Elena, we've collected data, we don't know what to do with it now, right? We want to share it with our funders. We want to share it with our partners. We want to share it with our community. What do we do with it? Just send me an email. I can send you some additional resources if you're not finding what it is that you need. This is a whole nother area of program evaluation that we dig into and that people focus on. The main part in terms of summarizing, sharing, and using findings are the things that are down here in green. You want to be able to identify your key points. You want to use clear language. You want to organize the information in a thoughtful way, present it in a logical way that makes sense. And then you want to use visuals and stories. As an evaluator, I get a bad rep. We get bad reputations for being like data nerds. This proverb is my favorite, right? Tell me the facts and I'll learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. Evaluation reports are not just about numbers, right? You have stories of your experiences, your clients' experiences, your partners' experiences. Utilize those. That's part of the picture that you're painting about the intervention and the change that you're having in the world. So don't assume that when we talk about sharing, when we talk about like writing up reports, that we're talking about charts and numbers all the time. And you probably have a lot of these stories, even without doing a full program evaluation. You had a conversation with someone that came through your doors. You have a follow-up email from somebody, a note that they sent you. You ran into them somewhere in the city and they told you about what they're doing now. Those are all stories that you can lean into when you're thinking about the impact of your work. All right, we have like a minute, 60 seconds for you to pause, jot down any next steps you want to take while it's fresh, right? So there's some questions here to guide you, like where do you want your organization to be a year from now regarding evaluation? What does that look like in 6 months? What do you have to do in the next 4 weeks to get there? We jot that down if you want to think in that sort of way, but even if it's just like, here are 2 things that I want to do related to this, take a minute now and write them down so we don't lose them. All right, you still might be jotting down some thoughts. You don't have to stop. I just want to make sure you see and you'll have this. Here's my contact info. Do not hesitate to reach out if there are additional resources that you need beyond what we share after today and on the NSP site. And then with that, I'll turn it over to Lucas or Tracy or Jessica or Gina to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Elena. And as you can see on the chat, we posted our survey link, and we use the survey link for a lot of the evaluation that you just learned about for our programming. So we encourage you to take that. And as a reminder, you'll be receiving the recording, the slide deck, and some additional materials in your email, as well as the link to the NSP workshops page where you can see all of the recordings and all the materials from all of our programming and recorded sessions. So thank you again for joining. Until the next one.
Thanks, everyone.